All right, hello everybody. Welcome to another seminar series. Today we have some Ganzfried. Sam is a founder of Ganzfried Research, where he works on fundamental problems in artificial intelligence and game theory, and consults on the applications of game theoretic algorithms to national security and fairness and security in online gaming. He was a principal investigator for a team with the DARPA initiative on serial interactions in imperfect information games applied to complex military decision-making. He was an assistant professor of computer science at FIU from 2016 to 2018, holds an PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon, and has an AB in math from Harvard. At FIU, he created and taught new courses in game theory and artificial intelligence. Thanks again for accepting our invitation. The floor is yours.
Thank you. And I see there's something in the chat. Someone can't hear, it sounds like. They're saying Maurice is having trouble hearing, so I don't know. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great. I'm going to be talking about new Grady, an AI system for robust, transparent grading. Actually, let me see. Okay, you guys can hear me now. I'm excited. This idea has been sort of a side project for several years. It sort of was inspired by some of my experiences teaching at FIU. And so I'm happy to be presenting it here to the FIU department. And actually, I'll mention I'm the product owner of one of the capstone project groups this term at FIU. And so I have several students that are working on, so far they've done various testing of the algorithm, and I'll be presenting some of their results. But I'm really looking forward to feedback from you guys, either positive or negative, because this is still a work in progress, and any feedback can be helpful in both improving the project and in what the students do with the capstone going forward. So I'm looking forward to feedback from all of you. So let me get started. So as you're probably familiar, so the two most common grading systems that are used are an absolute scale and a grading curve. And so an absolute scale, here's an example here. They say, this site says, this is the standard scale at most colleges, and many high schools use it. I don't know if that's completely true, but here's one example of an absolute scale where you say, okay, A plus 97 to 100, A 93 to 96, and basically you're assigning a numerical interval to each letter grade. By contrast, a grading curve is assigning a percentage of the students who are going to receive each letter grade. The top example, not particularly realistic because it has 68% of them getting a C, but it has 2% getting A, 14% B, etc. The bottom example from a course at UCLA has 5% A plus, 15% A, 25% A minus, etc. And so the difference here is that the curve is assigning a percentage, a fixed percentage to get each grade, and the absolute scale is assigning the exact numerical cutoff. So actually, before going forward, I want to see sort of a show of hands. I guess you can put in chat. I'm curious whether in your courses, I know there's many professors here, whether you normally use an absolute scale or a grading curve. So if you want to type 1, if you normally use an absolute scale, and 2, if you normally use a curve. I'm sort of curious. I don't know if I can see the chat, but I want to see if there's, so we see it 2. Anyone else? 1 if you use absolute scale, 2 if you use a curve. I see 1 person uses a 2. Any other? Okay, my understanding was that a lot of professors at FIU use an absolute scale. Someone uses absolute except for a very difficult course where there's a curve. Okay. So a mix. My understanding from FIU, from speaking to people, was that a lot of people use an absolute scale, whereas for my undergrad experience, a lot of classes use some form of a curve, although often they didn't even tell me exactly how the curve was going to be. But anyway, these are both the most common approaches. And so let's go through sort of the pros and cons of these approaches. So absolute scale is very transparent, right? The students know exactly, if you say, okay, 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, they know exactly what to expect, how the numerical score is going to be mapped to a letter. There also is no competition, right? It's not like, okay, there's only 5% of the class is going to get an A, then they have incentive to compete against each other, not help each other, and there's competition. In theory, everyone could get an A with an absolute scale. It's also very easy for the instructor, right? Once you have the scale in place, you look at the grade 93, okay, that's an A. So you don't have to do any, difficult calculations. What's a con of the absolute scale? Well, the main issue is that it really requires the instructor to know for sure how the letter grades are going to correspond to the numerical scores, right? And so if the instructor has taught the same exact course many times and used identical assignments, then they have a very good idea of what different number is worth. Then absolute scale makes a lot of sense. But in general, this isn't going to be the case, and it's very hard to be sure, especially if you haven't made the assignments, if you're teaching a new class, if you're teaching for the first time, it's hard to be totally sure how the numbers are going to correspond to letters, right? And what should you do, for example, if you have 90 to 100 A, 80 to 90 B, 70 to 80 C, and everyone ends up getting in the 70s, right? And you're using an absolute scale. Are you going to give them all C's? I don't know. And so fields are also rapidly changing, right? And so it's natural, like in AI in particular, but in other fields, you're probably going to want to change the assignments over time and not use the same exact assignments every year. Another issue these days is that if you're using the same problems over and over again, a lot of the common problems are available. There's these sites out there, Chegg and Course Hero, where they post solutions to a lot of these common problems. And so if you're reusing problems, people can maybe look them up. People can get solutions from students who took it in prior years. So in general, if you're going to be using new assignments and changing things up, you might not be able to easily use an absolute scale. So grading curve. So positive about the grading curve is that it doesn't really matter. I see someone in chat. I'm going to take a look at the chat. Did you find significant grade inflation as a cause of a curve? Well, the curve, it can be whatever. So it can be whatever you want, right? Like you can have the curve where you have only a small percentage of them getting an A. And so, I mean, the curve still leaves room for, you can have a hard curve. And so the curve doesn't necessarily imply grade inflation. You can have an absolute scale that has grade inflation if you say, okay, a 70 and above is an A. And so I don't know if the curve necessarily implies grade inflation or not, but that's something I will touch on a little bit later, actually. So grading curve is very helpful if you don't know what the difficulty is going to be in advance, right? If you don't know if are these exams going to be really hard, really easy, I'm not sure. And this way, the average is a 60, okay, I'll make 60 a B plus. Average is an 80, okay, 80 is a B plus. And so you don't have to worry about knowing exactly how the correspondence will be in advance. And this provides a lot of flexibility to come up with new creative assignments that would have been more challenging if you were locked into an absolute scale. Now, cons of the grading curve, one of them is that this could lead to inconsistency. One year, if a student gets an 80% and they're in a class of all superstars who are all getting in the 90s, maybe you end up with a B minus with the curve. The next year, a student might also get an 80%, but is in a class of a lot weaker students and ends up getting an A. This doesn't make a whole lot of sense. Two students, the same ability, and one's getting a B minus, one's getting an A just due to what the makeup is of the class. That doesn't seem right. Another issue, like I mentioned, there's this competitiveness, right? If there's only a limited number of A's, 5% A's, then the students have less incentive to help each other out. They can try to, trick each other and throw each other off and try to get their A's. And so that's not great either. One sort of extreme example that shows students could actually collude and game against the curve. There was an example at Johns Hopkins where a professor said, okay, I'm going to make the highest score on the exam an A, and then I'm going to curve based on that. And so the student said, hey, let's just all not take the exam, and the high scores is 0, and then we'll all get A's, which is what happened. And so that's not very good. And another issue with the curve is that, at least from my experience at FIU, it's decreased transparency. When I tell students, they're asking, how's the grading going to be? And I'm like, oh, I'm going to use a curve. The average will probably be around a B+. I don't think they really knew what I was talking about. Whereas if I say, okay, 90 over 100 is an A, they know exactly what I'm talking about. So, so in conclusion, comparing the two, in theory, I think absolute scale is better if you know exactly, if you've taught the course a lot, you have a really great idea how the letters are going to map to numbers. It's great, but in practice, that's not usually the case. And so both of these approaches have some clear advantages and some shortcomings, and so there's no clear-cut winner. And so that's sort of the motivation for this new approach, Grady. And so here's sort of a screenshot. So in a second, I'm going to do an example with the web application. And so here you can see Grady. This example, you enter the number of grades, number of students, and then you're going to enter an estimation of the absolute scale. So you estimate that, for example, A is 90 to 100, B is 80 to 90, C is 70 to 80. You're also going to estimate the curve component, that 20% are going to be A, 40% are going to be B, 25% are going to be C. And so you're sort of estimating both of these components, and then the algorithm is going to essentially optimize over these two forms of the prior to compute the grades. And so I want to share let's see, I'd like to share another, so I can type this into the web application. I don't know how to share, new share, okay. Yeah, let's do a new share. Okay, can you see, is it deterministic? No, it's not. I'll get to that in a second, but we do use a lot of repetitions in order to reduce the noise in it, but it's not deterministic. So here is an application, the application. Actually, I'll type in chat. This is available publicly. You can all use it. And so here, let me type in chat. Here's the link. And you're welcome to use it, to try it out, to either, later on. And so it's available publicly. And so I'm gonna just show an example with this example of how to use it. So we enter here, this example, 5 grades, 5 students. For A, I'm going to do 90 to 100. So A, B, C, D, F, upper bound of 90 to 100, and this is 0.2. B is 90, 80, 0.4. C is going to be 80 to 70 and 0.25. D is going to be 70, 65 and 0.1. And F is going to be 65, 0, 0, and 0.05. And then finally, you need to enter the actual numerical scores. So let me do a new share, 1 second, new share here. So then you can see here I have, here is just a CSV file. So I'm going to assume the students are getting 71, 74, 77, 78, 79. So they're all getting in the 70s, right? And we think that only 25% should be in the 70s. So it's a little bit unclear what we should do, right? Because the absolute scale would give them all C's, but the curve wouldn't want to do that. So I'm going to push, so now I'm going to go to browse and then enter it's Grady test, the CSV file, and then I'm going to push submit button. And so I'm going to wait for it to run. Let me minimize this. And so my screen sharing is paused, it says. Can you guys still see my screen? Hi, can you?
No, we don't.
You can't?
We only see the Excel spreadsheet.
You do see the Excel spreadsheet. Oh, can you see now the grade calculator?
No.
No, okay, let me add a new share. Okay, so I ran the grade calculator. I pushed solve on the grade calculator, and I entered all those files. And so it ended up producing these results here. So you can see now the scores. So we have A is a 0, B is 1, C is 2, D is 3, F is 4. So this is assigning a 2 to the 74, 77, 78. It's bumping up a 79 to a B, and it actually ends up bumping down the 71 to a D. So instead of giving them all C's, it sort of takes into account both. It ends up bumping up, this 79 up to a B, 71 down to a C. And so this is just, a simple example to show how it works, and feel free to, play around later with the this interface. So I'm going to close this. Let me get back to the presentation. Okay. Is it still showing my presentation?
No.
Okay, okay, so so that was that example. Everyone understand what I did with that example? And feel free to type anything in chat or interrupt me if anything's unclear. So as you saw in that example, so we have the architecture for Grady. So we have the inputs are going to be these estimates of the grade intervals, which is like the absolute scale component. We also have the estimation of the distribution, which is the perf component. And then we have the observations, the actual numerical scores, which we included in the CSV file. And so I don't want to get I don't want to make this too technical of a talk, but at a high level, so the algorithm is using a Bayesian Gaussian mixture model, assuming that we have these two components of the prior that are from the estimates of the interval and the estimates of the distribution. We're using Markov chain Monte Carlo method, integrating Gibbs sampler with expectation maximization to estimate the posterior. And we're going to do multiple repetitions, to make it more robust. And we're going to assign the grade that maximizes the mode of the estimation. So to answer the earlier question, this is not deterministic, but the more repetitions we use, the better an estimate we get. And we have an approach for parallelizing it. I'll talk about in a minute about the scalability. And then the output, as we saw, is just going to be an assignment for each student with the numerical score, an assignment of a letter grade. And so let me talk about the scalability. So this actually, I had the students in the capstone run some experiments to see the running time, how it varied. And so here we're looking, this is using 4 cores, and we're using, I think there were 10 grades in total. And so we're varying on the x-axis here, we have the number of students, and on the y-axis is the running time in milliseconds. And so you can see, for even up to 200 students, it's taking under 90 seconds with 4 cores. And so it's roughly a linear increase, but basically this scales to very large classes, right? Because it's just taking, on the order of seconds or minutes for even very large classes. And for a fixed number of students, it's going to be linear in the number of cores. So if I used 8 cores, it would take roughly half the time. And so this is applicable to, even very large courses. And so you could say, well, why do we need an algorithm? Why couldn't you just eyeball it? And so, so the problem, it's very, very easy if the scores agree perfectly with both the absolute estimates and the curve estimates, right? If everything agrees perfectly, then you can just use the absolute scale. However, in practice, it's unlikely that the actual scores are going to agree likely with both of them, even if you're sampling from the same distribution. For example, let's say you estimate that some 10 to 0 to 10, 10 to 20, 20 to 30, and you estimate there's going to be 10% in each, and then you just uniformly randomly generate 20 scores, it's unlikely you're going to have exactly 2 in each of the buckets, right? There's going to be some, deviation. And so it's unlikely you're going to have scores that exactly agree with those. It's challenging to figure out what's the optimal way to balance between them. And so this is where the algorithm is useful. And it's possible that the output is going to agree more with one or the other component, with the absolute or the curve component. If there are any questions, please let me know. But if not, I'm going to run into a few examples. So the students in the capstone, I had them just generate a few different examples to see how the algorithm behaved. And so in this first example, we have these 10 grades, 0 to 10, 10 to 20. You can name them whatever you want to. And the prior was that we thought there would be 10% probability of each, and there were 25 students. And so we have they generated, I think the scores were all just uniformly random in 0 to 100. And so you can see that for the most part, the scores, so these are the actual student score, and then the colon, and then the grade assigned by the algorithm. For the most part, it agreed with what the prior absolute scores were. I think there was one in this example. So you can see that one place it didn't. So there were no zeros. There was really, the lowest was an 11. So it didn't end up giving anything a 0. It actually ended up bumping down. You can see 20.4 gets assigned to a 1, and 21 gets assigned to a 1, even though they're slightly over 20. And the reason here is that there's already 3 that are assigned to a 2. It has 29.6, 26.8, 21.5. And we really think that there's, 10% are going to get each. So it ends up bumping down these borderline really low 20s, end up getting bumped down to a 1. Other than that, I think these scores just agree with the absolute scale. So this is one example. And here's a second example. In this example, we have 6 grades. This is a little bit more realistic because you can think of, like an A minus, B plus, B, D, F, and 26% getting the A. And so this is 6 grades, 25 students. Although here, I believe the scores were also generated uniformly at random, which is a little bit not realistic. And it's, as a result, it has a lot of scores below 50, right? It's getting, if they're uniform random, then about half are going to be below 50. And so again, here, we're noticing it's roughly following the absolute scale, except that we're seeing it's bumping up. A 45 is getting bumped up to a 1, 47 bumped up to a 1, 41 bumped up to a 1. So because it has so many zeros and it only thinks 2% should be a 0. And so it's sort of compensating for that by bumping up the 40s up to a 1. Let's see the comment. Describe the algorithm. What is it optimizing? Well, so it basically, it's doing this Gaussian mixture model, and it has these forms of the prior, and then it's estimating the posterior, and then I'm picking the mode. I'm running it many times, getting a sample from the posterior, and then like it's giving, if I run it once, I might say, okay, the 36 is getting in the B range. I run it again, okay, 36 is getting in the D range. And so I run it 1,000 times, and I pick the one, I have the 1,000 samples from the posterior, and I pick whichever is the highest one. And so we can chat later if you want to, I'm trying to not be too technical in all aspects of the algorithm, but that's what it's optimizing. It's sampling, there's these 2 inputs as the prior, it's sampling from the posterior, and then it's trying to pick the value that maximizes finding the mode of the samples from the posterior. So, and so this example, we see that it does compensate for all these low scores by bumping up the 40s to be a 1. One final example here has 9 grades and 12 students. And we can see here, the thing about here, this example is a little strange because all of the scores, this is not uniform random scores. All of them are below 30 or above 90, except for this one, the 89. Whereas we think that not that many of them are going to be below 30 and above 90. And in this case, it does still mostly go with the absolute scale, although it does bump up the 26 does get bumped up to a 1. But other than that, it mostly follows the absolute scale. So, these are just a few examples that the students from the capstone generated just to give an idea of what the output is of the algorithm. So transparent. So what do I mean when I'm saying that this algorithm, one could argue that this is not transparent because it's using some algorithm that the students wouldn't really understand. So what I mean by this is that on the first day of class, the instructor can publish and say, okay, I estimate 90 to 100 is going to be an A, 80 to 90 is going to be a B, etc. I estimate that 25% of students are going to get an A, 40% are going to get a B. And so the students, even if they don't understand exactly the technical aspects of the algorithm, they still have a pretty good idea of how their numerical scores are going to correspond to grades, right? Part of my challenge when I was teaching undergrad AI course, and I think a lot of the students hadn't had courses with a curve before. And so when I was saying, oh yeah, I'm going to use a curve, the average is probably going to be around a B+, I don't think they really understood what I was talking about, right? Because they kept asking, how's the grading going to be? How's the grading going to be? And I was kind of vague about a curve. I think it would be very helpful if I said, look, the estimation is that this is going to be an A, this is going to be B, and the estimation is that this percentage will get A and this percentage will get B. In that way, it's a lot more transparent than just vaguely referring to a curve. I see there's a hand raised. Yeah, Louise.
Yes, I have two questions. The first one is you mentioned that you will, prior to the class, as you begin the class, you're going to determine what the prior distribution for grades are going to be. How do you determine this, given that different student groups should yield different distributions of intelligence, and that should affect your results?
Well, there's of course going to be some uncertainty, but I'm leaving out to the professor to come up with an estimate. Now, the thing about the algorithm is that if one of the if they don't exactly add up, like you might have your absolute scale and you might have the curve. And I gave an example where sort of it wasn't what you expected, right? Like you really thought that 25% would get in the 70s, and then everyone ended up getting in the 70s. And the algorithm still sort of accounted for that by bumping up the 79 got a B, and it bumped down the 71 to a D, because you put prior weight on the B and the D, and so the idea is, in any grading scheme you're going to need to have some sort of estimate, right? Whether if you're using an absolute scale, you're going to say here's exactly what we're going to use. If you're using a curve, you're still going to have to specify what probability is going to be in each range. So regardless, you're going to have some estimate, and this just allows you to specify both of these so that they can sort of balance out each other if one of them is off.
So is there a sort of expectation that there will be an adjustment as you go on through the course, given how wrong the initial prior was?
Well, the idea here is that that you don't adjust it, that this is the transparency is that you're in the first day of class, you're publishing, here's how the grading is going to be. And if you really, I suppose you could put a weight on the distribution. So your concern is that the absolute scale, absolute estimate is going to be way off, and you're going to want to resort to the distribution, it sounds like, right? Because
no, my concern is that given that you have no knowledge of what different student bodies are with respect to their distribution of intelligence, that your prior distribution, given the way that you set the weights like you did on the website, are going to be so far from reality that it is an inapplicable distribution. Like what if your initial expectation, so for example, in the example that you gave with the website, where all of the test grades were in the 70s, but you had an initial belief of 25% for A's, and this sort of goes into my next question, is it's sort of distorting the grading scale, because everyone is in the A, you expected a quarter of the class to have A's, but nobody does. They're all within a very, more like Dirac mass distribution. You see what I mean?
Well, as you saw, I mean, it ended up, the algorithm ended up not, so you're saying, are you saying the algorithm we should have given some of those students A's, or, because we really, I mean, this comes back to, I mean, you might not know, so let's go back to the absolute scale, right? Like, we're assuming you have some idea of what is going to correspond to what, but you're not totally sure. So maybe you've taught the course once before, maybe you've taught, I'll give an example coming up shortly where like I hadn't taught the undergrad AI course before, but I had taught a different course before. So I had some idea of how the difficulty would be of my assignments. And so if you have some idea of, okay, like a 90 should be an A, like I've taught this a few times, I really think, even if I change things up a little bit, I estimate 90 to 100 should be an A, 80 to 90 should be a B. And then if they're all getting in the 70s, you saw what happened in that example. It ended up changing things a little bit, but it's still not giving them an A. But I mean, if you really have no information whatsoever, I mean, there's not much you can do if that's what you're getting at. Like if you're going into it with no prior, you've never taught anything before and you have no idea, you haven't talked to other professors, you have no idea at all what to expect, then I guess this isn't applicable if you can't even create a reasonable prior. But so I'm sort of assuming you have some basis to construct the priors. You've taught something before, you maybe taught the course once, you've talked to other people, but if you have nothing to go off of, then I guess this approach is not going to be helpful, but you're going to have trouble with any approach if you have nothing to go off of.
Great, thank you. And very quickly, just for the second question, which is again relevant to that example that you gave where everyone fell within the 70s grades. Would you be concerned that this could be sort of a distortion of the true gain comprehension on the student's part? And maybe there's a conversation with respect to ethics where a student may have, barely passed with a C, now has failed a class. Is that some sort of concern when implementing something like this?
You're saying that a student ends up getting an F?
So for example, like the minimum passing grade is a C, but because of this new grading scale, student went from a 71 to from a C to a D, and now they failed the course. Is that?
I see what you're saying. So for one thing, I mean, you could make the prior probabilities of an F be, 0.0001 or something, right? You can, and I'll talk about that in a second. I mean, also like you can, even though this is an algorithm, like you can still put in little, if someone's going to fail, you can overrule, you don't need to follow this to a T when it regards failing. But yeah, there is a problem with, it could put grades, round them down if the scores end up being sort of higher than you're expecting or something. If there's a mismatch, it could end up rounding some of them down, but you could try to address that by putting if I made the prior on a D and an F be really, really low compared to a C, B, and A, it would be less likely to do that. And so I would say that, in general, like you should be making the F and the D, should have really, I don't think they should just be 0, right? If someone gets a 0, they should fail, but make them, really, really low, and then the algorithm would not be very likely to assign to round them down, like you mentioned, to a D or an F. So does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
So, okay, let me continue. So then a criticism. So let me clarify, using Grady, it does not mean that the instructors no longer have any control within the grading, right? This doesn't mean, okay, the algorithm is doing everything and the instructors have no role. For one thing, the instructor, as we just discussed, I mean, the instructor has to, actually, I see, here is your hand up. Let me finish this slide and then we'll do the question. So for one thing, the instructor selecting all these prior parameters, right, gets to choose the estimated percentage of for the intervals and the percentage that are going to get each score. Also, the instructor can do whatever method they want to get this final numerical grade. You can have, 25% homework, 75% final exam, etc. So there's still a lot of room for the instructors to have a role here in the grading. It's not simply that an algorithm is doing everything, because I know a lot of professors like having input in the grading, of course. And so, yeah, let's answer your question.
Yeah, Sam, I do want to say that I find the idea really appealing and very intriguing. The concern I have is, would this be explainable? Would you be able to defend a single grade? For instance, you said that it's not deterministic, which means that for a single person, for a single student, maybe 50% of the time he or she falls in a B, and 50% of the time he or she falls in a C. Then whatever grade you assign, would you be able to defend that? What do you do in such cases? And also, how do you explain to someone how do you explain the reasons why somebody got a certain grade? I mean, I love the idea of trying to find a balance between a fixed grading scale versus a curved scale.
So one comment I have from my own experience in undergrad, very rarely did anyone ever explain to me why I took a class, I took exams. Usually they didn't tell me anything. Sometimes they would say, okay, the average was a 72. And then you get an A-. No one explained to me, okay, here's why you got an A- for this and this and this reason. No. So no one really explained to me really ever why I got a grade. So I feel like I shouldn't have to explain, just because I'm using the algorithm, like no one explained to me. So I don't think there's always an expectation. A lot of professors, they look at the curve and they come up with clustering and they do something weird and they don't always explain what they're doing to the students. But I mean, if you can sort of show that this algorithm is taking in these priors that you're telling the students, here are the priors, and it's actually optimizing the posterior. And if I'm doing enough samples, so part of the issue with what you're saying, so if I just run, so I'm repeating it many samples. So right now I'm doing 1,000, I could do even more, right? If I just did 10 samples, then you might get really unlucky. You might assign someone who got a good score something low, but if I do 1,000, 10,000, a lot of samples, it's really gonna get pretty close to the actual posterior. And in the limit, I mean, it would be optimal, assuming the algorithm is converging. And so the only explanation would have to be, look, we've tested this and we know we have we're running large enough number of samples that we have high confidence that we're picking the right score.
Yeah, but if you end up giving bootstrap scores or something like that, saying how many times this particular grade was confirmed by your algorithm, then there could be ones where the number is weak.
And I'm observing numbers, especially when they're around the cutoff. I mean, I'm observing times where it's pretty close between, 400 of them give it a B and 420 give it an A. And so I'm going with the mode and giving it I'm not doing a randomized, I'm going with whatever the mode is. But, if I did 1,000 other samples, the mode might be a B instead of an A. And so, I mean, that's going to come down to me testing it enough to know that I'm picking large enough number of repetitions to have confidence in the result. But I don't think, I mean, it doesn't seem necessary to be able to explain. I mean, maybe you do it in your course, but I don't think I ever had any course I took in college where a professor explained to me why I got an A- or why I got a B+ or whatever. You took the class, you get a grade.
That's fair. I sort of agree with you. It's just that in contentious cases, you would have to defend yourself in some form, or I would expect myself to have to defend my grade in some way. And simply blaming it on an algorithm is, again, going back to this controversy about explainable AI. No.
Sure. Well, this can be another challenge. I mean, you can still use the algorithm and then have some room at the end to, you can still overrule it. You know, I mean, I'm not saying you have to use this and then that's that. Like, you know, this is just a new approach, whether it's integrated directly or whether you use it and then you modify it afterwards. You know, is certainly that could be useful. There's another question in the chat about, we're expected to be very clear in the syllabus. Well, I'm not so sure about, I don't think you're required in the syllabus to say exactly. So when I taught, I mean, I said, okay, the grade is going to be 25% homeworks, 50% exam, 25% project, but I don't think you're required to say, you know, 90 to 100 is an A, 80 to 90 is a B, or just like, if you're using a curve, I don't think you're required to say exactly what you're going to be using. And actually using the Grady is a lot more information than when I taught my course. I didn't say what the curve exactly was going to be because at that point I didn't know. And with Grady, you'd be telling them, you'd be saying, here, you know, I'm expecting 90 to 100 to be to an A, 80 to 90 to be a B, 70 to 80 to be a C, and I'm expecting this percentage to be each. So it's actually giving them a very good idea in the syllabus of what to expect, to answer Hadi's question. And yeah, I mean, there can always be disputes. I mean, with any system, there's going to need to be some, you know, you can overrule it if something strange happens or, you know, unusual circumstances. But Hadi, did that answer your question in the chat? Okay. Yes. Okay. So, where was I? Transparency, role of instructors, and another issue. So another issue that this helps, actually related to what we were just talking about. When I was teaching, you know, like, you know, I'd do the material in the class and it'd say, you know, okay, any questions? And often, a lot of the classes, a student would say, how's the grading going to be? How's the grading going to be? And I was like, well, we're going to use a curve. The average will be around a B+, but, you know, I can't say more than that. And it sort of detracts, you know, the course should be mostly about learning the material. It shouldn't be, you know, constantly talking about the grading. And so with Grady, you're publishing these estimates right at the first lecture. And even if they don't completely understand the details of the algorithm, they have a good idea that 80 to 90 is roughly going to be a B, and roughly 40% are going to be there. And, you know, they have a good idea of what to expect, and you're not going to get these constant interruptions. And, you know, it's going to have less stress on the instructor rather than having to constantly field questions about sort of a vague curve, or if you're not specifying how the grading is going to be. And so let me just summarize again some of the benefits that I've mentioned. So it's going to reduce this competitiveness element. We saw with the curve, right? If only 5% is getting an A, you know, you might have competitiveness. Students aren't going to help each other out as much. Here with Grady, you might have an estimate that 5% are going to get an A, but it's still possible if everyone gets 100, they're all going to get A's with Grady. And so it's still possible everyone gets an A. And so it's going to reduce that. It's also going to reduce this inconsistency effect we saw with the curve, where, you know, an 80% can be an A one year and a B minus the next year, because we have this estimated interval. We estimate that an 80, you know, is going to be 80 to 90 is going to be a B, and so that's going to help curb this inconsistency effect. I'll get to the question. Let me finish this slide. This also, we don't require the instructor to know exactly what the absolute scale will be. We only an estimate of it. And this gives more flexibility to create novel assignments that you might not be totally sure about the difficulty. I demonstrated the scalability, showed it can apply to very large classes. And in particular, you know, there's all these online, these MOOCs, these massive open courses that might be looking for a standardized approach. And so Grady scales to very large classes. I showed that it still applies In the case where you have grades and they deviate significantly from what the prior is, it's still going to produce some intelligent results. And it's also transparent at the start of the course in that the professor's publishing, here's the estimated intervals, estimated percentages, and the students have a very good idea of what to expect right at the first day of class. Yeah, Luis, question.
Yeah, I was wondering if there is any comparable literature where instead of changing a grading curve, you maintain an absolute grading curve, so it's very clear what the grading scale is, regardless of student inputs and output based on their performance throughout the class. And rather than changing that, keeping that constant and changing, for example, the teaching style or the assignments and examinations themselves such that it's more evenly distributed in terms of difficulties of the question.
So you're asking, is there research that's looked into whether the absolute scale is better than a curve? Is that roughly what you're asking?
No, so what I'm wondering is there's been research and a lot of questions regarding how to properly curve the final performance of the classroom. But has there ever been research regarding how to change the classroom so that the grade distribution is more even? So instead of trying to have a class where all of the grades are in the 70s and disperse them so that you have, you know, a normally distributed grade or something like that, instead you change your tests such that it produces that distributed outcome.
When you say more even, it's not, so you're trying to get the scores to be more close together. Is that what you mean by getting the scores more even?
I'm trying to do the backwards of what creating a curve is. So you have an absolute grading scale, right?
Okay.
And you change the tests and the assignments so that instead of having them produce everybody in the 70s, you get a range of grades from A through F to see if that produces a better and more predictable outcome.
Well, when you had everyone getting in the 70s, I didn't know everyone would get in the 70s. That just happened. You know, you have the priors, but then you give the actual exam, and then you get the observations, and you don't know exactly what they're going to be. So I'm not sure if I totally understand the question. But one thing I will mention, if you were asking about prior literature, I know there's one, I can find the link. There's one paper I saw, it was a theoretical economics paper that showed in theory that the absolute scale has better theoretical properties than a curve. But like I said, in practice, it's hard to do a pure absolute scale unless you're very sure about the parameters. But yeah, sorry, I don't think I fully.
Yeah, let me
your question.
rephrase it. Yeah, let me rephrase it. So for example, when I asked you before about that prior distribution, you said that it requires some base knowledge of what outcomes would look like, right? So having some prior teaching experience would help you with that. I'm wondering if instead of utilizing that knowledge to create a curve, you utilize that knowledge to change the test questions and their difficulties so that it produces your intended outcome, instead of having the tests as they've always been and then utilizing a curve to have that expected outcome.
Well, okay, so I'm not making any assumption that you're using the same test that you always have. I'm allowing, you know, you could change the part of the goal I'm doing. If you've taught the class 10 years and you're using the same exact test, you should probably just use an absolute scale because you kind of have a good idea of everything. So the benefit of Grady is that I allow you to introduce new assignments, new exams, and you don't know the difficulty, but you have some estimate. Like you know, like I know that I generally give it. I'll show on the next slide. I generally give, you know, have low numerical scores end up, I give hard exams, but I had a curve that compensated for it. And so I know that about what I do. But the one of the benefits of this is it allows you to give new assignments without locking yourself into a rigid absolute scale. And so does that answer your question?
It does. And just for a quick follow-up, and this would be it, is there strong pedagogical research regarding having tougher exams that produce lower grades and then curve fitting? Thank you.
Is there research looking at having tougher exams? I mean, I think I actually am not sure. I do want to look more into the literature, but I mean, I think, if everyone's getting 100, I mean, it's probably too easy. You're probably, not, making, not challenging students and not, giving them enough advanced material. But yeah, I'm not familiar if maybe someone is aware of some other literature on it, but I'm not aware of literature that's saying, there was one paper that did show that if you give if there's exam where students or the averages are in the 30s, that the students get demoralized or something, and if they're in the 60s or 70s, that they like it better. So there was one paper that said something like that, but I'm not aware of any literature that says that having bigger curves with lower exam scores is better. I'm generally a proponent of making sure everyone is challenged to an extent, and I don't want to make it so easy that the top students are just not having to do anything, right? I want everyone to be challenged, but I also want everyone to be able to master it, most of the material too. But that's a personal preference. And I'll take a look later if there's literature on that question. And so we have 5 minutes left. I'm basically wrapping up. I can sort of skip over this, but 2 points, someone mentioned like grade inflation. So like one potential use of this system could be to help standardize the system between different courses to reduce biases that might creep up, or maybe some professors grade a lot lower than others, and you could impose some sort of a limit that the prior on an A has to be below 0.5 or below 0.25, or you could say that the failure prior has to be below some threshold as well. And so you could sort of standardize the system in a way, if the department wanted to, between different courses. And to sort of close, let me sort of relate this a little back to FIU. So FIU, I found this on the web so there's 9 different grades that are used at FIU. And so let me talk about my experience. Like I mentioned, I had difficulty. I had taught a graduate course, and so I had an idea. So on the left here, I taught a graduate course, and there were 9 students, and these were their numerical scores, and these are the letter grades I ended up assigning them. And the second column here is what I ended up using. So I ended up basically giving a 70 to 100 A, 65 to 70 A minus. Now this I made up at the end of the course when I made the grades. I didn't publish anything in advance. And so then afterwards I went and I taught undergrad AI course, which I had no idea of how the students would be or what the exams, how difficult everything would be. But I did have my own experience having taught this other course. I know I make pretty hard exams, and the numerical scores are usually pretty low, but I use a curve. And so had I had no other information, but only used estimated things for my other course, so I would have had, 2 out of the 9 got an A, 4 out of the 9 got an A minus, etc. And so basically, instead of giving a 0 to these bottom 4, if I add the point, make them 0.01 and then denormalize, I would have this 4th row. And so if I used this for the prior, as well as the A being 70 to 100, A minus being 65 to 70, on the far right is the grades of the students in the undergrad AI class. So in the parentheses is what Grady would have given them, and the first letter is what I ended up giving them. And so you can see that they would have been pretty close. The only difference here would have been that Grady would have given a bunch of these people that got A's, it would have given them A minuses, because the prior is that there's the 43 on the A minus and the 20% on the A. And so it would have bumped down a bunch of these low 70s down to an A minus. Now, we can debate whether that's good or bad, but I guess I probably wouldn't have used this. This prior is a little bit strange to have only 10% on a B plus, 10% on a B. So I probably wouldn't have used this exactly. But this gives an idea. Even if I had nothing else to go by, I could have done this for the estimate, and this would have helped a lot in my case, because I could have said, rather than just say I'm going to use a curve, and I think as a bunch of the students got spooked, they get a 70 and they freak out and think they're going to fail, and I'm like, don't worry, I'm going to use a curve. Had I said, look, I estimate 70 to 100 is going to be an A, 65 to 70 is A minus. I estimate that 42% are going to get an A minus, and 21 are going to get an A. I think had I published that initially, they would have had a pretty good idea of what's going on, and it would have helped a lot with my experience in that course. And so just to wrap up, I posted in the chat, I posted the link to the web application and the credentials to use it. Feel free to use it on your own course or any example you want. And you can also, if you have a larger instance or if you don't want to use it directly, you can email me your instance, the parameters. I can solve it and tell you what the output is. And I welcome positive and negative feedback. This is still a work in progress. And as I mentioned, there's the capstone group that is working on it this semester. So any comments can guide what we sort of test and work on going forward. And if you have any other colleagues you think might be interested, feel free to pass it along to them to try out as well. And yeah, and so I think I'll end it there. And if there's any more questions, happy to answer them now too.
Thank you, Sam, for the interesting talk. So now let's open the floor for some Q&A. Is there any questions? Any other questions?
I answered a lot of questions during the talk, so there might not be any additional ones, but.
So I have one question. So I think I get the idea of the motivation behind having a better algorithm for grading. And so I think my question is how we can scientifically measure the fairness of this algorithm of this sort. Suppose we want to compare that with standard grading curves. And is there any mechanism, is there any quantitative methods like we gave, we have a fairness metric, for instance, from 0 to 100, and we were able to measure the fairness of, these algorithms against other kind of algorithm against standard grading curves. So is there anything that, any thoughts? I would like to hear your thought on that.
So that's actually something I'd like to come up with some metrics that, such as fairness that you mentioned, that would enable me to say, look, compare this approach to the absolute scale and then the grading curve, and be able to come up with some concrete metrics, which unfortunately I'm going to have to sort of leave that as future work, because I haven't really been able to put a lot of thought into that. And that's something I did want to really think about, is coming up with some concrete metrics for fairness and to sort of say, look, this is better than the curve. Unfortunately, all I can tell you is sort of the general advantages and disadvantages that I've mentioned in the talk. And if you have any, do you have any thoughts yourself on this issue? Because this is something I want to look at, but I unfortunately don't have a good answer for you right now.
Yeah, sounds good. That would be an interesting path when we actually look at the data longitudinally. For instance, if there is a course and we want to monitor it for instance, 5 semesters, and see how this algorithm works in the long run. in terms of fairness when compared to, for instance, standard curve grading curve. So that was something that came to my mind and I had a question about. So there is another question in the chat. Maurice asked, how can we follow the project? So I think you partially mentioned that, but it would be good to reiterate it again.
How can you follow the project? Well, for one thing, I mean, you can use the web application, and which, you know, it's still a work in progress, and you know, there might be changes down the road, but you can use the web application. I might, that site that I have up, I might, if there's updates or new information, maybe I'll post them on that grady.ddns.net. And I mean, I'm doing the capstone, so I don't know at the end of the term if the students are going to present their work or not. I mean, if any updates, if I have a paper on this, I'll publish it on my website. But I would say check this. The grady.ddns.net has the latest version of the web application, and I'll post updates there. I guess on that site, I'll post if there's any news or updates on it. I'll post on that grady.ddns.net site.
Yeah, sounds great. So any other questions? All right, so it's already past 3, and thanks again, Sam, for sharing your research with us. And with that, we conclude this week's seminar, and let's keep in touch. And thanks everyone for attending, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Bye, folks. Have a good one. Bye.